Don't forget tomorrow evening at the Event Center, Celebration Recovery is celebrating 2 years, and their workers have come in and worked hard doing their different parts to make it happen. And I'm going to share just a few minutes speaking to encourage them. And sometimes folk that struggle with a lot of things need to be encouraged by the presence of others. You know that kids would do anything sometimes to have dad's approval? They would just about lose their soul to get dad's approval, or mother's approval, or some teacher. That's why some young people get lost out there in life because somebody approved them that they never got at home. And I'm just saying, sometimes people who struggle with a lot of things need the approval, and they could stand your presence to slip in tomorrow evening, board members and whoever you might be, just to let them know that we as a church stand behind this ministry and these people. We're starting a brand new Sunday school class. We don't have it totally organized, but Kelly and Eric Anderson are going to be coming over on Sunday evenings somewhere in the next couple of weeks. And Paul Anderson's going to get a room lined up for them. And Paul, if you get a chance, could you just get a little sign-up sheet in the back? And we're looking for new people to make up that class. We're not trying to swap bottles and put different labels on bottles, but if you're not attending and you want to be in a good class, why, we'd encourage you to sign up. And let's have a good number. I'd like to see us start off with about 25 in that class. Sign up for Eric and Kelly's class on Sunday evening. Continuing our series through the summer that we've been doing week after week in our search for the 12 apostles, those 12 that Jesus surrounded himself with, poured his life and ministry and thoughts and passions and trusted them to carry out the ministry of the future. Now we come to an apostle by the name of John. Mark writes about him in his Gospel, chapter 10, verse 35. And he writes, "And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, come unto him, saying, Master, we would that thou shouldst do for us whatsoever we shall desire. And he said unto them, What would ye that I should do for you? And they said unto him, Grant unto us that we may set one on the right hand and the other on the left hand in thy glory. But Jesus said unto them, You know not what ye ask. Can ye drink of the cup that I drink of, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? And they said unto him, We can. And Jesus said unto them, Ye shall indeed drink of the cup that I drink of, and with the baptism that I am baptized withal shall ye be baptized. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it is prepared. And when the 10 heard it," you talk about creating a rumble and discord. When the 10 heard it, they began to be much displeased with James and John. John is often depicted in ancient art as leaning against the breast or the shoulder of the great Son of God. He seemed to have a special place with him. Jesus trusted him as one of the new leaders of the church, and I believe that he trusted all of them, but it seemed or assumed that there was a special bond between Jesus and John. You know that Jesus' mother, her name was Mary. She happened to have a sister by the name of Salome, who married a fisherman that built a great empire in the fishing industry. His name was Zebedee, and he had 2 sons. They did, and they raised James and John. They would have remained in that business, except Jesus, the cousin of James and John, came along one day and told them they ought to be fishers of men. And they left their dad's business. let him down, walked off from the fishing industry, and became great fishers of men. Now, what do we know about John? First of all, we know that he's the youngest. We don't know his age, but we know that he's the youngest of all of the apostles. As I've already stated, we also know that he has a brother by the name of James, who had participated together in the fishing business, tied up with their father, Zebedee and sons. And that's the way the sign read. I saw it. About like your amens. I heard it. And so we know not only that, but John, his influence has made its way all the way down through the centuries, and even today we're impacted by the influence of John. John wrote 5 epistles that bear his name that became a part, or 5 books that became a part of the New Testament. There's the Gospel of John, there's the first, the second, the third epistles of John, and then there's the revelation of St. John the Divine, better known as the book of Revelation. 5 books, more than any of the other apostles. He had 5 books that made their way literally into the New Testament, and that last book being the last book that closes out time and eternity as far as the Word of God's concerned. We know something else about John. Jesus gave John a nickname, like he did some others. There was Simon, whom he added the name Peter, Peter meaning rock or stone, a foundation we can build on. And it was fitting his personality. And so when Jesus names John, he called him Son of Thunder. And the reason being it fit his personality. Young, ambitious, opinionated, zealous, and had a fiery temper. Made up his personality. And as we continue on in the message, you'll see how his temper and his opinion became a tripping stone in his attempt to serve Christ. But through that, he would learn and he would grow in faith. One of the things I find so interesting about the 12 apostles as we've studied them, we've looked at them, is that we discover their humanity. We see ourselves in their lives. We see ourselves in their faces. To many people, the apostles were like stained glass windows. But in reality, in the New Testament, it gives us an inside view on the human beings who wanted to follow Jesus so desperately and many times came up short of measuring up. But Christ loved them. He included them. He believed in them. He accepted them, just as he did this young, ambitious, opinionated, know-it-all apostle named John, the son of thunder. Now let me build on that for a moment by putting it like this youngest of the apostles, filled with passion, filled with opinions, filled with temper. There were things that he desired. There were things that he wanted. He had his own agenda. I think sincerely he wanted to be a Christian, but he struggled in some issues that didn't quite line up with what Christ desired. And not just John, but all of us in general. First of all, John had a desire for power and position. Now, in the scripture, there's an interesting interchange that takes place between Jesus and these 2 brothers, James and John. James and John come to Jesus one day, and they say this: when you come into your glory and you come into your kingdom, one of us would like to sit on your right hand, and one of us would like to sit on your left hand when you come into your throne. Now, what's going on? Early in the scriptures, you'll notice that Jesus is telling them that he's going to Jerusalem, and it'll be his final hour of passion, and he will be crucified, and he will die. And as they hear this, and they're thinking, man, if we don't hurry, we're going to miss out on this position thing. And so they get him to one side and said, we we want to be on your right hand, and my brother wants to be on your left. I don't know which one said that. And this is what we want. We want right seat and a left seat. We want the best seats in the house. There's a lot of things on my mind right now that I can't dare go into. I'll be as good as I can and stick with notes. It'll keep me out of a lot of trouble later. Now, when they talked about a left-hand seat and a right-hand seat, it didn't mean anything about actual seats. It didn't mean anything about an actual chair. It's a Middle Eastern image for when you're on your throne, we want some of that power and we want a place of prestige. One of the interesting things is Matthew, in his little gospel, he adds another little thing. He says that their mother came to Jesus and said, my boys are kind of special. Have you ever had that little story? If you ever be a landlord, you'll have people come and say, now, my dog never uses the restroom. It just eats food and that don't go anywhere. It's amazing when they move out, the smell that's there. You could, well, I'll be good and not go any further. My boys are kind of special. I'm not saying they're better than others, but really they are. And so when you come into your kingdom, now understand you're my nephew, Jesus, and these are my boys, and I want you to treat your cousins a little bit better than the rest of these guys. I want you to give them a right-hand seat and a left-hand seat. I want a place of power and prestige. Now, whether it was the mother coming, whether it was James and John, I really don't care. But what I'm saying, John is saying, I want to be one of the chosen ones. I want to be one of those. And how did Jesus respond to this whole chosen one concept? He looked at him and said, I don't think you know what you're asking for. I'm facing the cross. I didn't come to be served. I've come to serve. In other words, Jesus is saying, I didn't come to raise people up into power and prestige and position. I've come to liberate people and to set them free. And what Jesus is really saying is, there's only one chosen one, and it's me. In other words, James and John, you need to go over and sit down with the rest of the group. I'll tell you, God has to deal with some of us over the years so we can learn, doesn't he? Manipulating, maneuvering, that's James, that's John. Can I just stop on that for a moment? I want a right-hand seat. Can I just stop on that for a second? Hello? I'm talking to the wall now. I ask you. Let me just talk to you about the right hand, just for a moment. Maybe you already know this, so it's going to be redundant to you. Do you remember when Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, came to him and he saw how weary Moses was? 2.5 million people, and Moses is trying to judge all of these issues, and can you imagine how many? He must have been one worn-out boy. No wonder he was the meekest man in the Bible. I'd be pretty meek too after I get beat up time after time, day in, day out, always wrong. And he said, you need to choose 70 elders and let these elders become a part of this judgmentship. Fact of the matter, when you get into the New Testament, the Pharisees became that eldership, and they set themselves up as a judgment club. And historians say there was never more than 70, just like Jethro said, get 70. And so what they would do, the Pharisees, they would have this great U-shape, and they'd have 35 on this side, 35 on that side, then two main chairs, the right-hand chair, the left-hand chair, and they would bring in the accused and set them down in the middle of this judgment bar. And the left-hand side, they would bring all the accusations against the accused. This is what I know, this is what so-and-so said, and this is what we suppose. And on the right-hand side, it would be the responsibility of that one in that chair to say, no, I think they're innocent. And so the other side is heaping up all the scorn and heaping up all the accusations. And on the right hand, he's saying, no, I believe in them. I trust them. I don't believe all of that. And they're heaping it all up. Quite interesting, isn't it? And so as all of this is happening, Guess where Jesus is seated today? Anybody know? He's seated on the right hand of God the Father. He's not on the left hand with all the accusations. That's the devil's chair. He's seated on the right hand, and he's representing you and I. And here comes the devil, and he's heaping up all of these accusations. He said they're not good enough, they're not worthy enough, and they've got shortfalls and their weaknesses and all of these things against LaSalle. Just like the devil did with Job. You say he's perfect. He's not a perfect man. You watch his wife. She's going to walk out on that old boy. You just wait and see. He'll go through the awfulest divorce. It'll just ruin his name. Hey, look at his kids. He's all the time praying for his kids because they're not living where they ought to be. If you take away his health and take away his wealth, and he's going to lose all of his friends. And God speaks up and said, I believe he's perfect. That's what I have to say. I believe he's perfect, and he represents it that way. And for all eternity, Jesus is going to be seated on the right hand of God the Father. And when all the accusations are coming in from the left hand, Jesus on the right hand will say, neither do I condemn him. That's who I want to stand before the judgment bar. The right hand, and have him say those words. No one else can be on the right hand and the right side of God, only Jesus, the supreme judge. And James and John were clear out of line to make this request. It's what they wanted. Read it, it's right there in the scripture. I'm not making all of it up. A desire for power and position, the right and the left. And Jesus responds, that's not how it works. And by the way, it didn't go over very well with the other 10 disciples. They said, what? You want power and position? The rest of us left everything to follow Jesus too. Who do you think you are to ride shotgun throughout all the ages of eternity being on the right-hand side? Doesn't Jesus love the rest of us? Doesn't he believe in us too? What makes you so special? And the fact that prior to all of this happening, they'd been haggling over who's the greatest in the kingdom. Did you remember that? Which one does Jesus like the most? Which one does he love? And which one's on the inside? And Jesus responds, it's not about power and position, John. John's young. He's got a lot to learn. And in his zealous moment of passion, he always wanting power and position, wanting a seat on the right hand and the left hand. Jesus saying it's not how it's going to happen. John had a desire for power and position. He'd have to learn that's not what but that's not all he desired. He also desired seclusion and separation. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 49, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name. And we forbade him because he followed not with us. We stopped him because he's not on the roster. He's not a part of our apostolic group. And Jesus said, forbid him not, for he that is not against us is for us. Now again, I want you to catch this scene in your mind. John comes to Jesus one day and he says, we were out and about and went around this corner, and here's a guy preaching on the sidewalk. His hair didn't look like a preacher's. He didn't have a necktie on. And we got to asking around. Nobody knew what group he belonged to, and he don't belong to our group. It says it right there. And how did Jesus respond? He says, if they're not against us, they must be for us. Something that John had a lot to learn about. He's assuming that this group of 12 had the inside track, and that Jesus is with the 12 and not with others. And by the way, John in his gospel, he never brings up anything about this. Notice how quiet he is about this little story about how he tried to stop somebody else from casting out devils. Brad Hirschfield grew up in Chicago. He was an Orthodox Jewish family, a great family. In his 20s, he became very concerned about the conflict going on in the Middle East, especially down in the West Bank between the Palestinians and the rest of Israel. He took his money, pulled up stakes, moved all the way to Israel, moved out on the West Bank, and he joined a militant extremist group whose plan was to drive out the Palestinians and to keep them out of the Holy Land so just the Jews could have it. They did a lot of street fighting, did a lot of killing. One afternoon, his little group of Jews were fighting the Palestinians, and the bullets are flying. Some stray bullets from their own guns went through the window of an elementary school, killing 2 little Palestinian schoolgirls sitting at their desks, not old enough to create any kind of a problem. And when it happened, physically, he became ill out there on the street when he heard about their blood covering the desk to the floor. And psychologically, he went into despair, and emotionally, he had a breakdown. It was like an awakening. And he left that group, and he wrote a book, and his book tells his experience, and it was entitled, "You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right." Quite insightful about his struggles. And he subtitled it, "Finding Faith Without Fanaticism." And when John came to Jesus that day, he was upset when he found somebody else doing ministry that wasn't a part of their group. And he tells them, "Stop." And Jesus said, "Wait a minute. If they're not against us, they must be for us." So what is Brad doing today? He renounced his militancy. He's renounced his extremism. And he started an organization that's working today, and they're working for those Jews and those Palestinians to lay down their weapons and to find some kind of a peace treaty and work together. Brad said, we've got a long way to go. It's not about right and who's wrong. It's about we're in this together, and we need to make it a better world. And John assumed this is the way Jesus felt because it was the way he felt. And he was expecting Jesus to say, "Good for you for hindering." But he said, wait a minute. Now, could I just stop for a moment and say I'm glad to be a part of the church? If you look at the sign out yonder, and I don't ever mention it hardly ever in these 27 years, it says Church of the Nazarene. What I want to say to you is we're more than just this one church. We happen to belong to a number of other churches. Fact of the matter, there's over 22,392 organized churches that make up what we call the Church of the Nazarene. We have 52 undergraduate and graduate educational institutions in 35 countries on 6 different continents, and our people worship in 212 languages in more than 180 nations around the world. Our membership's around 2.5 million people. I'm glad for the difference we make. I'm glad for the influence we can have on the world, but I'm under no illusion that we're the only ones that have Jesus. Did you get that? Or that we're the only ones carrying out God's mission and purpose in the world. And how tempting it is to get into John's frame of mind to think if you're not a part of our group, there can't be possibly any other work of God going on. And Jesus himself reveals to John that God's work is on a bigger scale and a bigger level. And we need to work together, not against each other, like the guy that went to heaven and heard something on the other side of the wall. He says, are there somebody over? Yes, they think they're the only ones in heaven, so be real quiet. It's kind of like that in our little world, isn't it? Sometimes we think we're the only ones, and we get arrogant about our small little mindedness. We get to defending our little quirks and pet theologies, and we get the feeling we've got a corner on this thing. John had a problem. He had to learn that God is bigger than our pettiness and our smallness. That it's not about position, it's not about power, it's not about seclusion and separateness. God's at work around the world. And if they're not against us, they must be for us. Now, in this same passage, and the reason I raise it, because even after this experience with the other group and telling them to stop, and Jesus telling them to work together, he still doesn't get it yet. Because John had another desire, and that was John wanted to be judge and jury. It wasn't just the position and power. It wasn't that he didn't like other groups out there doing ministry. He actually wanted to be the judge and the jury. Where's that, preacher? Well, it's right there in that same passage in Luke 9. After that experience of Jesus saying that they're not against us, they must be for us, and now Jesus and his apostles, they're moving their way towards Jerusalem, where he said he would go and where he'll die on the cross. And as they're heading toward Jerusalem and the disciples are heading along with him, to get straight there, they had to go through Samaria. And you have to understand this, Samaritans and the Jews did not get along together. And so they would go around the city of Samaria so they wouldn't dirty their feet. Plus, Samaritans didn't want them there either. They had been left out, excluded, not wanted, and despised, and so they had a resentment toward the Jews. And so as they started to pass through Samaria, the Samaritans stop them. Pass. And guess the attitude suddenly that John had. Here's what it says here in chapter 9, verse 54. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, that they wouldn't let him pass, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down out of heaven and consume them? Really? Fire out of heaven? Burn people up? Now you got to see the scene. Samaritans wouldn't let them pass. And what was John's philosophy? Just nuke them until they glow. Don't laugh. I've seen it around the church world these days. Maybe not here, but them other bad places. We don't need them on this planet. It's just a bunch of stinking Samaritans anyway. Just consume them. Now, one question I have about this, I am sure that it's not possibly relevant to our world at all, so just humor me for a moment. When they came up and they said, let's just call fire down out of heaven, please don't get angry with me, okay? I wish Jesus that had put his hands on his hips and said, go ahead, I'd like to watch this. Since you got all power. You couldn't even cast out devils, and I'd given you power to do that back in the first chapter, and just so many chapters later, you're not getting it done, and you're finding fault with somebody that is doing it. Now let's see you call fire out of heaven, oh boys. But he didn't, because he's Jesus. Would it be great to have Jesus pastor us? Maybe. Only problem is Jesus could call the fire down out of heaven. And he might even set some people on fire. Just a thought. And John, he says, just call fire down out of heaven. They're losers, always causing problems. Just nuke them. Wouldn't it have been something to stand back and watch the fireworks? What a display. Consume them. You know what? The scriptures don't say much about what Jesus said, only a stern rebuke there in verse 56, for the Son of Man has not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. In other words, we really don't know what he said. Code for that is, it probably wouldn't have fit into writ, what he said. I know one thing, they never brought it up again. They didn't, and I wouldn't. But his whole philosophy was, just let the fire from heaven fall on them. We live in a world where people want to call fire down on others and judgment down on others, and it's the same John attitude. And it's in this moment the apostles learning, wait a minute, this isn't what Jesus is like. Just like he did when he told those people to shut up and go home because they weren't a part of the crowd. He wants to call fire down. Now they go forward toward Jerusalem. Jesus is about to be betrayed, about to be crucified. And he is one of those who abandoned Christ in that hour. A preacher of another denomination that writes articles, he wrote this in the Circuit Rider. One of the many problems with arrogant and closed-minded, absolutist religion is what makes people intolerant to anyone who disagrees with their rigid position. And then he gave this example. He was a pastor. He said a couple began to show up at his church and liked the church. And word got back to the church they came from, and it happened to be one of those denominations that if you don't go to our church, you're going to go to hell. We're the only ones. You say nothing like that. Well, right here in town, I stepped into a little meeting a few years ago, and pastor looked back over at me and he said, I want that couple over there to come up and sing. And if you get saved, the only two churches you can get saved in this whole town is their church and my church. People gasped and looked back at me sitting on a seat. Pretty arrogant, wasn't it? We're the only ones and the rest of you aren't. And the other guy's church was out of town, so I guess there's just one church in town in his mind. When word got back to this pastor that they had visited this other church, he went to their home and he told them, you can't go there anymore. Well, they said, we've experienced. He said, if you go there, they said, we're thinking about joining. He said, if you go there, we'll cut you off. You'll burn in an eternal hell and damnation. Fire! You'll burn in fire. They finally told him to leave the house. And the following Sunday, they joined the other church. And he goes on in his article to say, these attitudes are far too common in our world. And yet the John syndrome often responds just like this apostle did. Now the question that comes before us is this: would John ever learn? Immature, shallow? Would he understand who Jesus was, about wanting a seed, about calling fire down from heaven? Would John ever learn? Well, the matter of fact, it's a beautiful story about John. Did you know that the apostle would become the longest living apostle in history? He would outlive all the rest. He would carry his ministry long past the death of Christ on the earth. And John would learn about humility. John would learn about love and compassion. Two of the things that were missing in his life in his early years with Jesus. Didn't have much humility, didn't have much compassion. But he would learn love, and he would learn what love was really like because Jesus would keep on loving him. And he had areas in his life that he needed to grow, and Jesus kept working on him with patience. And about his attitude, it was bad, but obviously Jesus just kept loving him. Do you know how we know that? One of the powerful things about John is this: when he wrote his gospel, the Gospel of John, many years after Christ, never once does he ever mention his name in his own gospel. He only says the disciple whom Jesus loved. No less than 5 times in his gospel, he refers to himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now many, and I have felt that way too, have felt like that was very arrogant of him to say that, like Jesus loves me, this I know, the Bible tells me don't love you so. But that's not what he's saying when you look at his life and all that he had to work through and all the problems he had to deal with and with all of his past. When he wrote this gospel, he had learned humility and compassion to the point that he wouldn't even take credit for it. He wouldn't even name himself. He would say the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's not saying it in arrogance. You know what he's saying? I'm the disciple that Jesus kept loving when I wasn't lovable. And when I didn't show love to many others, he's kept loving me. When I didn't show the compassion to others like I should have, he kept showing compassion. I'm the disciple whom Jesus kept loving. And did you know that when he was an old man, he was so old he couldn't walk, they would carry him into those little churches on a bed, and as they'd carry him down the aisle, historians would say he'd lean up on an elbow and he would say to all the young people as they carried him down the aisle, little children, love one another. Read his epistles, written in his final hours of life. Little children, love one another. Why? Because Jesus had kept loving him until he began to understand what love was about. Now, he lived longer than all the rest. How would he die? He didn't suffer martyrdom. No. He wasn't crucified upside down. He wasn't sawn asunder. He wasn't burned at the stake. What would happen to John was this: the Roman emperor, somewhere around the 80s AD, would have him arrested. He was a leader of the early church. And they arrested him, and they exiled him to an isle called Patmos. It's about 30 miles off the coast of Asia Minor. It's set out in the blue Aegean Sea. About 12 miles long, a few miles wide. And it wasn't a sabbatical It didn't happen to be a paradise or a vacation center. It was a Roman penal system. Penal colony. It was a prison. And John would never leave the isle except in the Spirit. He would live out his remaining days. Now, there's many stories, many legends told. One has some foundational truth, and I merely mention it to you in passing. He never wrote his books till he was on the Isle of Patmos. And it is told that he led a Roman soldier to faith in Christ. And he had written some of these books there, and it is said that that Roman soldier smuggled him off the island and got him somehow down to the church at Ephesus. And from Ephesus, they began to spread these books that he had written, the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Epistle of John, the book of Revelation that he worked on. It was all passed on. And the very fact that 2,000 years later we're still talking about it, he had a lot to learn. He had a lot of rough edges. He was often judgmental, often condemning. Jesus had to show him a better way, and he saw a better way, and it led him forward to a life of faithfulness. He could have walked away at any time and said, if you don't see it my way, then I'm hitting the highway, but he didn't. Now, one last thing I want to share with you. I'd be remiss to close. God forgive me, but I never saw this till this study. I saw it, but I didn't see it. Do you know in the final hour of Christ's passion, all men, he said, forsook me. Talking about his apostles. They all left him, high and dry. Many of us are like John. We want the best seats in the house. Sometimes we want power and position. We often want that group to go away, and wouldn't it be nice sometimes if God would just call down some fire on some people that have hurt us? And when we have seen John, we sometimes see ourselves. But before you judge him too harshly, did you know that John was the only apostle mentioned or named at the foot of the cross? The only apostle. No one else was there. His mother. But John showed up. Now, they'd all forsaken him. They'd all fled. Judas Iscariot, he went out to do what he would do, that dastardly deed, and he'd stolen the money, he'd lied, and he betrayed the Christ. But somehow faith must have got a hold of the heart of John. And I can see him leaving the crowd where they're hiding in fear of the Jews and the law. And somehow he makes his way out of the huddle and slips out of that building and makes his way up the wet streets of Jerusalem and down those back alleys. Something big is happening outside the walls. And he makes his way into that skull-shaped hill, and in the moon glow or in the light of whatever he could see, hanging on the cross was the great Son of God, his own cousin. And Jesus looks down, in spite of the blood trickling down his face from the cruel crown. His side is sore from the spear. His tongue is swollen from drinking the vinegar. But he looks down, and in those dying moments, he saw John. And he said, John, would you take my mother home? Would you take care of my mom? I'm going to trust you with my mother. Greatest gift God ever gave a boy was the gift of a mother. And Jesus was saying, I'm going to give you the greatest gift I could ever give you. I'm going to give you the gift of my own mother. And historical facts is, John had the privilege of taking home Mary, the virgin mother of Jesus Christ, and caring for her until she died. The relationship that Jesus had with John had transitioned. It had transformed from this young, impulsive, zealous, anger management needed apostle, full of opinions and anger. And there John stood at the shadow of the cross of Jesus, And Jesus called him by name. Now, after this journey that we've made with these apostles, the number one thing that I want you to hear is that all of us stand at the foot of the cross. All of us with our hang-ups and our he-cups. All of us with any sin or shame or whatever we might have in our lives stand at the foot of the cross. And Jesus looks down and he never says anything condemning. He knows us by name. And this morning he calls out my name, your name. He knows about our unkindness. He knows about our humanness. He knows about our shortcomings. He knows where we jumped and we didn't reach the mark. We missed it. We came up short. He knows about every regret that we wrestle with at night and we can't lay them down and we can't sleep. He knows about our pain. He knows about our past. But he doesn't bring that up. What was it that he told the apostles? I didn't come to give you a lot of leadership and power and prestige and buying your way into the best seats in the house. I came to set men free. I came to liberate. I want to liberate you from your pain and from your past and from all the pessimism and all the things that you've dealt with. And he looks at us, and this morning, just like he did John, he calls us by name. And he gives us the church to take care of the church till he comes. Father, take this little message. It wasn't too polished this morning. Would you talk to all of our hearts? Would you help us to be a better disciple? Would you give us a disciple's heart? We're glad that as we have watched some through the years, how they matured and how they mellowed. I think of my own father. Lord, an example right in the house for me. Watch him go from judgmentalism to getting tender, mellow towards those years before he died. Experience taught him that he didn't know everything. And that he needed to back off in criticism, be kind. And so it was with John. And Lord, when you look at us this morning, if you see things in us, we've got a lot to learn. If you see areas of adjustment needed, would you help us to look internally and not look at anyone else in the house or in our lives? And say, Lord, the message of the apostles is for me. And I see myself somewhere in there. And at the foot of the cross, would you heal me of my pain and my past? And would you set me free? And would you liberate me to be the kind of tender Christian that you've called me to be? Minding my own business, serving you, and introducing the kingdom of God to others. Would you allow that today? In Christ's name. Amen. Stand with me if you would. Let's leave the house today to be a better disciple, a better follower. I don't know how it is with you. I don't need any big seats, whatever that represents. I'd just like to be used a little bit in kingdom building. Would you join with me in that same desire? Shake hands, visit. May God bless you as you go. Sing us out if you would.